Chapter 11, An Experiment. When my kids were very young, I believed that behind closed doors, all mothers had messy houses. Everybody was like me. I assumed that they cleaned when guests were expected, but after the relatives left, their houses became disheveled again, just like mine, and they lived with that dirt and clutter until the next party, just like I did. I never imagined that anyone, especially working mothers, could maintain order just for themselves. I had accepted the attitude, learned from my mother, that life is chaotic and there's nothing we can do about it. A home's dark entryway stays dark because buying a light bulb and then changing out the old one is too much to handle. When drug addicts overrun your house, you don't get in their way. Chaos is a way of life. Chaos felt like home. The more I dropped in on people, though, the more I experienced that most neighbors and friends lived in routine order even when nobody was looking. Their houses reminded me of Mrs. Legrand's kitchen table with its fabric runner and matching salt and pepper shakers. And now, even though I wanted to emulate Mrs. Legrand, I saw the difference between my minivan, fast food trash, socks under the seats, the chocolate milkshake I forgot to wipe from the back cup holder, and theirs, vacuumed and tidy. I remember a fellow teacher, another young mother, talking about the nightly habit of cleaning up after putting the baby to bed. "I won't sleep," she said, "if I don't go through the house and put everything in order for the next day." "Oh, I know," I agreed, nodding my head, but really I had no clue that people did such a thing. This woman and I were friends. Still, I didn't admit that I could fall asleep easily despite the dirty dishes. What I really thought was that after a whole day of teaching and mothering, of suppressing a frequent desire to be still and alone, once the kids were bathed, read to, and tucked away, straightening up seemed unreasonable. I was jealous of her. How could she be so much better at life, at mothering, than I was? Soon after Ethan was diagnosed with ADHD, I was browsing the parenting and psychology sections of Border Bookstore, looking for nothing in particular. From the shelf, I pulled Women with Attention Deficit Disorder by psychotherapist Sari Solden. I stood in the aisle leafing through. This was a new concept for me. Women with ADD? Today, the connection between my brain and Ethan's ADHD seems obvious. Back then, I saw ADHD as something limited to naughty little boys. I wasn't convinced that Ethan had this disorder for sure, or even if it was a real disorder, so I didn't imagine that he could have inherited this condition from me. When I got to the part about Solden's own struggles, her cluttered house and filthy car, I was agog at her similarities. But when she described her need to pretend to be someone she's not, hiding the way she really lived, I started to cry. Literally, I dropped to my knees, floored by fear and relief right there in Borders. Too embarrassed to see a psychiatrist, I took the more direct route. I stole one of Ethan's pills. I was home alone one morning, declaring the theft an experiment of motherly concern. If I'm going to give this medication to my son, I should know what it does. I decided to try what he called his homework medicine, a short-acting variety of methylphenidate that he could take after 5 p.m. after his morning pill had worn off. Unlike Ethan, I didn't need pudding. 10 minutes after swallowing, I had a strong urge to stand up and do something. I wanted to load the dishwasher and wipe the countertops. I wanted to sort through the pile of papers cluttering the kitchen shelf, to sweep and mop so that when the rest of the family came in, they'd feel happy to be home. I felt alive, engaged, not as I had feared, strung out or manic. And I didn't get jittery the way I do after too much coffee. For once, there was no barrier between me and what I needed to do. As I bustled around for 3 or 4 hours, happy and productive, I declared the experiment a success. The medication would be fine for Ethan, and I would consider going to the psychiatrist myself. When Bruce got home, he was pleasantly surprised by my burst of energy. The kids didn't notice because the meths never bothered them in the first place. The next afternoon, I just didn't feel like creating essays. I'd already procrastinated for a week and knew my students would loathe me if I came to class empty-handed. I'd be one of those lazy teachers mothers complained about. But to write useful, encouraging feedback, I needed creative energy, which for me was depleted most days by noon. I dreaded the hours at my desk, plodding through each comment, each word. I glanced at Ethan's pharmacy bottle behind the kitchen sink. First of all, I figured nobody would know. I was the only one keeping track of his monthly prescription, and Ethan didn't take this homework pill every day, so he had some to spare. Second of all, yes, ADHD stimulants are classified as Schedule II controlled substances regulated by the government to prevent illicit use. But I was not a criminal. I wasn't selling it, for God's sake. I was in my own kitchen conducting a motherly experiment. With no priors, I'd be looking at a civil fine of a few $1,000s at worst. After months of occasional experiments, I found a psychiatrist. By the time I sat in his office, I had already completed several online tests, which I could manipulate to get the conclusion I desired depending on the day. Sometimes the diagnosis seemed comforting, a clinical reason for my behavior, absolving me of immorality. Other times I deemed the diagnosis an outrageous, self-indulgent excuse for laziness. I had found two types of tests, those designed for the general population, men, which were targeted toward hyperactivity, and those designed for women. On the general test, comprised of only 6 questions, I scored fine. For example, how often do you have difficulty concentrating on what people say to you even when they're speaking to you directly? Never. How often do you fidget or squirm with your hands or feet when you have to sit down for a long time? Never. The questionnaire designed for women, though, really got me. Do you spend your time coping, looking for things, catching up, or covering up? Do you avoid people because of this? Yes. Have you ever been thought of as selfish because you didn't write thank you notes or send birthday cards? Yes. Do you start the day determined to get organized and the end of the day feeling defeated? Yes. Are you clueless as to how others manage to lead consistent, regular lives? Yes. Do you despair of ever fulfilling your own potential and meeting your goals? Yes. The psychiatrist, it turned out, didn't ask me many questions at all. I told him my symptoms: forgetful, messy house, hard to focus on tasks I wasn't interested in, symptoms present since childhood. That's all he needed. After a brief appointment, I walked out with my own prescription. I was struck again by how unscientific, how subjective this diagnosis was, both for me and Ethan. I didn't trust it. I did, though, get what I came for. In the decade to follow, ADHD medicine allowed me to meet the unrealistic expectations of suburban motherhood, giving me the discipline to focus fully on my kids. And I'm thankful for that.